Hello everyone, and welcome to SUNUP. I'm Lyndall Stout. We begin today talking livestock production and a topic often in the news about cattle. Here's SUNUP's Curtis Hare and our Extension beef cattle specialist Dave Lalman to sort it out.
The relationship between cattle production and the environment is always a topic of concern, and we're always hearing about cattle flatulence. And Dave, there's a misconception when it comes to cattle flatulence.
There's a big misconception. So 85 to 95% of the gas that cattle produce comes out the front end, not the back end. So cattle flatulate very little. So most of it is from burping or belching after they've fermented their feed, and the methane is a byproduct of that fermentation process.
And when it comes to methane, what's the overall impact in the United States that cattle production has on the environment?
So according to the EPA, it's about 1.8% of the methane produced in the U.S. And that's from the beef cattle industry in the U.S., 1.8. So if you compare that to the EPA's estimate for transportation, 27%. The EPA's estimate for electricity production, 28%.
And one of the reasons it's not so high is just kind of the relationship or the cycle of methane in cattle production. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, so they produce 1.8% of our total production, but the thing is, if you include the cycle of methane, it's actually almost net zero impact on greenhouse gas ability to capture heat in the global warming effect, okay? So let me explain that just a bit. When that methane is eructated, it goes into the atmosphere, and then through a process that lasts about 10 years, it gradually gets turned back into carbon dioxide and taken up by plants, which the animals are able to graze, and they burp methane and it starts over again. So if the number of cattle in the country stay about the same over time, that 10-year cycle, basically the methane contribution does not change very much.
And while it might not be, a big impact, it's still something that you're concerned with here at Oklahoma State, and the work that you're doing is to try to reduce that as much as possible.
Well, sure. I mean, just because it's low as far as the environmental impact doesn't mean we shouldn't try to reduce it, because, really, if you think about it, everything we do on SUNUP, everything the Cooperative Extension does for the beef cattle industry, everything our Ag Experiment Station does to try to, improve production practices, and the best management practices that we recommend are aimed at improving animal well-being, health and well-being, which tends to increase their productivity. Increasing their productivity reduces the amount of energy and carbon that they have to consume to produce 1 pound of good quality food for humans. And so everything we do in improving over time, and by the way, the beef cattle industry has improved over the last 20 to 30 years substantially in terms of that carbon footprint. So yes, we will continue because that influences profitability, right? And that's a big concern of our producers, obviously.
And it all goes back to management practices.
Best management practices are a way to reduce our carbon footprint and reduce methane production.
All right, thanks, Dave. Dave Lalman, beef cattle specialist here at Oklahoma State University.
During the spring calving season, while these beef cows are at the peak of lactation, I think it's a really good time to look at them closely and write down in your calf record book any cows that you see that look like they might have an unsound udder. We've done some research here at Oklahoma State University looking at the impact of what a dry quarter, or in some cases a couple of quarters, on a cow might mean in terms of weaning weight, and it's rather substantial. The data would suggest that if a cow has only one dry quarter, that she will wean a calf that's 50 to 60 pounds lighter than counterparts that have fully sound udders. So it's very, very important to identify those cows. And that's a huge economic loss just due to that particular trait. Now, the fact that this situation is heritable, I think is very, very important. Data from years ago always indicated that udder soundness in beef cattle was about 25% heritable. In other words, 25% of the differences in udder soundness was due to genetics. More recent data with just Hereford cattle from Kansas State University, published just 5 years ago, indicated that it may actually be a little bit higher in that breed at about 32%. So we can make some progress in our herd by selecting against unsound udders and over time improve the udder soundness in our entire cow herd. The things that we want to look for as we're examining these cows this spring is two different traits that I'd really pay attention to. If you find a cow with one of those very, very large funnel-shaped teats, that's a good opportunity to write that number down, and you probably need to expect that that cow has had some kind of infection, perhaps mastitis, in that teat, and it's a very good chance that that quarter is actually dry or non-productive. The other thing to look for is the very pendulous udder, the one that has lost the strength in that suspensory ligament that holds the udder up next to the abdomen of the cow. Those things, as she ages, will weaken and allow that udder to get very, very low to the ground, make it difficult for her baby calf to get up and find that teat within the first few minutes of life and have the best chance to get the colostrum that it needs early in life. Let's watch for those two traits as we examine these cows this spring. And if we see some that have some problems, let's write that down in our calf book. And then next fall, we probably need to make some decisions about whether we're going to keep her in the herd or her heifer calf so that we can make some improvements in the long run in the udder strength in our cow herd. Hey, we look forward to visiting with you again next week on SUNUP's Cow-Calf Corner.
We are talking alfalfa management now with Extension Specialist Kelly Seuhs. And Kelly, you've been out and about around the state. Give us an idea of what you've seen so far.
Well, things have happened pretty quick. About 2 weeks ago, I was out scouting and looking at some of our fields, and we were seeing early hatch small larvae. Nothing to be concerned about at that point. Within a week's time, the population's exploded, and producers, station personnel, everybody basically south of I-40 were either spraying or considering a spray. So it's definitely time for those folks to be out and looking, and if they've not already sprayed, they need to be out looking and seeing what's going on.
So the weevils are out and about a little later than usual based on the temperatures and the rain?
We're actually in our normal, what we would call a normal season right now. Our peak time for weevil larvae is probably in about mid-March to mid-April. And so we're actually right in the middle of that right now. And so our timing is pretty consistent with what we normally see on a normal year. So we're looking at needing to be out in the field scouting and doing what we need to do and making the decisions right now, because this is a peak time for larval development.
So what kind of guidance are you giving to folks? Some people have sprayed already, some people haven't. What's the best bet right now?
Well, if you've already sprayed, generally you have a 2 to 3 week window of efficacy for your product, and you won't have to spray again until during that time frame. If you have to spray too early, the problem becomes the residual of the insecticides won't last over about 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the product. So, if by chance you have to spray in a time frame well before harvest time, then the first harvest, then you run into the problem of potentially having to make another management decision before first harvest. And that's what some of the folks down in the south are having to deal with right now. They sprayed 1 to 2 weeks ago, and depending on the height of the alfalfa, they're going to have to make a decision, probably because we're seeing some second flushes of activity, continuation of egg hatch, and so there's another set or additional set of larvae coming on that they may have to make another treatment decision. So that's another reason to be in the field scouting and seeing what's going on, because you never know what that number is going to be. We're probably not going to get any help from the weather, and so at least down south, things may materialize again where they may have to make a spray decision. At this time of year, we're looking at cowpea, pea, and blue. They can also, all three can cause problems. Cowpea is not a new pest, but it's something that's given us some problems in recent years because of the conditions we've had, the change in the moderate temperatures in the winter coming out of dormancy. But it's kind of still a relatively new pest that we've seen some increased activity on. But so far, we've not seen threshold levels of any aphids at this point. That could change with the weather, of course, but as we start warming up, getting to 80, 90 degrees to that point. So up until about our first harvest. So we're still watching them, but at this point, they're not of any concern at this stage.
All righty, well, keep us posted. Thanks a lot, Kelly. And to read more about alfalfa weevils in Kelly's latest newsletter, just go to sunup.okstate.edu.
Welcome to the weekly Mesonet weather report. I'm Wes Lee. Almost the entire state plunged below freezing on the last day of March. Only Idabel in the far southeast didn't record a freeze. Just because you make it past the last average freeze date for your area doesn't mean you're in the clear. This map shows the date of the latest spring freeze events between the period of 1981 to 2010. It indicates that nowhere in the state are we past the date of the latest spring freeze. In 2013, not covered during the time frame of this map, a large part of western Oklahoma froze on May 3rd. A 3-day average 2-inch soil map shows temperatures are between 46 in the Panhandle and 56 in the south. This is a few degrees below normal for this time of year, but probably warm enough to begin the germination process of most garden seeds. Next week's forecast is indicating the likelihood of warmer than normal temperatures. Gary is up next to talk about the outlook for the rest of April.
Thanks, Wes, and good morning, everyone. Well, today we're going to start with the drought monitor as usual. Then we're going to take a look back at March and then take a look forward at April. So let's get right to it. Drought monitor remained with that same area down in southwest Oklahoma with abnormally dry conditions. No drought officially showing up yet, but just abnormally dry conditions with deficits going back to the beginning of the year and a little bit before that even. Other than that, the rest of the state still looking good. No abnormally dry conditions and no drought, more importantly. Let's take a look back at March now. The percent of normal rainfall map from the Mesonet shows, again, down in southwest Oklahoma, still with that deficit, and again, that dates back to the beginning of the year and even before that. But also, much of the state was actually below normal from southwestern up through north central Oklahoma. Then much of the southeastern quarter of the state was also below normal. And we had those generous rainfall amounts out in the Panhandle and in west central Oklahoma and then scattered about smaller areas of the state. But overall, it was a dry month for many Oklahomans, and that didn't help the southwest get rid of that abnormally dry yellow color on the drought monitor map. Now, it's also colder than normal. Again, we're dealing with lower maximum temperatures, and that's what we had across the state in March, from 3 to 4 degrees below normal in many areas. Just a few areas at or near normal down in the southeast and then over close to west central Oklahoma. But other than that, it was a pretty cold month across the state. Now let's take a look ahead from April with the outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center. We see increased odds of above normal temperatures in the western Panhandle and then parts of northern and eastern Oklahoma. And then for precipitation, we see increased odds for above normal rainfall amounts across the entire state, especially down in far southern Oklahoma, just the very tip. But in general, increased odds of above normal precipitation, which is good news. As usual, we can use some rain over much of the state. The good thing is the prospects are looking good, so we'll see where we go from here. That's it for this time. We'll see you next time on the Mesonet Weather Report.
Gypsum. It's one of those compounds that I get a lot of questions about, and I really hear a lot of misconceptions about how do we use it, what it's used for, and everything like that. First and foremost, we need to remember that gypsum is calcium sulfate. So we have a calcium tied to SO4 sulfate. It's one of those compounds that I get a lot of questions about, and honestly, I hear a lot of misconception or misunderstandings about how can we use gypsum, how does it interact in the soil, and what does it do to the soil. Calcium sulfate is primarily used in the remediation of sodic soils. Now, sodic soil is a soil that has too much sodium in it, and it creates a dispersive situation that water can't go down because the sodium is large, and it prevents water from moving down. We use gypsum because the calcium sulfate breaks apart fairly easily within water, and we apply gypsum so the calcium breaks apart, displaces sodium off of the soil particle, and then we can flush it down with irrigation, rainwater, otherwise, and get the sodium out of the system. Another popular use for gypsum is in peanut production. Gypsum provides both calcium for the pegging and for the formation of the nuts, and then the sulfur is needed in legumes and the sandy soils, and also helps with the digging process. Now, one thing that I get a lot of that I try to correct people on is using gypsum to lower soil pH. Now, this is just not correct. It's not accurate. Gypsum, calcium sulfate, is applied thinking to lower soil pH because it has sulfur in it. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. We use elemental sulfur to lower soil pH. That's because elemental sulfur, when applied to the soil, turns from S in biological activity, turns it to H2SO4, so sulfuric acid. Once it goes into sulfuric acid, that sulfuric acid reacts in the soil solution, releases a hydrogen, leaving SO4. After that, so we've lowered the soil pH because we've added hydrogen to it, and we leave sulfate. Gypsum can't lower the soil solution with its sulfur because it's in a reduced form. So adding gypsum to lower the soil pH just is not going to do anything. We can see gypsum used in areas that have irrigation water that have high bicarbonate concentrations. So if you look just north of Stillwater in the Ponca, Blackwell, that region where we have irrigation water, irrigation area, you start on a field and the field's pH might start at about a 5.6 pH. After 10 or 15 years of having this high bicarb irrigation water, we're seeing pHs move to 7.8 to 8.0 range. So we have this increase in soil pH primarily due to the addition of bicarbonates. Now, if we were to add gypsum to this scenario, it would provide calcium to bind with the bicarbonate, because what we don't want to do is overload the system with bicarbs, because that calcium would start binding with the bicarbs that's going in, is going to bind with all the calcium in the soil, and at some point you're going to see that pH shift, and we're going to have a field that's really non-productive. So we can counteract the bicarbs in the irrigation water by adding gypsum. So yes, we're applying gypsum to a field that has high pH due to irrigation water, but it's not in efforts to lower the pH. It's in efforts to bind with the bicarbs that are being added in the irrigation water to prevent the pH from going up any higher. For more information, check out the SUNUP website at www.sunup.okstate.edu.
It's that time of the show where we dive into all the grain markets. Kim, where are we with them?
We're at low prices. You look at wheat, we're near 5-year lows. That May contract, $4.40. The July contract at $4.46. Only a 6-cent spread there. The good news there on the wheat market, though, the futures is down. The basis is relatively high, but the cash prices are low, so that's kind of a wash. You look at corn, we lost 16 cents after the report came out last week. We gained about 11 of it back and just left corn prices in the tank. Soybean prices down around $9 on the board. That May contract, the November contract at $9.35. You look at cash and it's $1 or so lower than that. So soybean price is low. The good news may be cotton. We've gained about 6.5 cents in cotton in the last 3 or 4 weeks, and cotton's at 77.5. And you look at that East contract, it's at 76.4.
That's a lot of price differences in all the different commodities there. You did mention cotton, and cotton seems to have, grown across Oklahoma in the past couple of years. Where are you seeing planted acres for Oklahoma?
Well, if you look at what the The plans are for planting cotton on the U.S. Acres is supposed to be down 2% at 13.8 million acres. The Oklahoma acres are supposed to be down about 8% to 720,000 acres. You look at corn nationwide up 4%, 92.8 million, but in Oklahoma down 6%. Sorghum, the U.S. at 5.1 million acres, down 10%. Oklahoma down 17% expected on sorghum plantings at 250,000 acres. Canola down 50% at only 35,000 acres of canola. Soybeans nationwide down 5%, but up 3% in Oklahoma at 650,000. And peanuts nationwide are expected to be up 2% at 1.4 million acres and up 25% in Oklahoma at 20,000 acres.
How are things looking right now when it comes to crop conditions?
Well, you look at wheat crop condition, it's significantly better than it was last year and the year before. Then last year you got 69% of the crop good to excellent, only 4% poor to very poor. Kansas is pretty close to the same. Texas is not quite as in good condition. They've only got 48% good to excellent and 18% poor to very poor.
This is a question I feel like I ask quite a bit, and I don't like asking, but how long do you think these low prices are going to stick around?
Well, if you look at the wheat prices, right now they're determined on the world market and really determined in the Black Sea area. The good news is that stocks are relatively tight in the Black Sea exporters, that's Russia and Ukraine. A glitch in the weather and production in those countries, we could have a relatively good rally in wheat prices. But if we don't have poor growing conditions in the Black Sea area, then you could see prices being down in the below $5 range, or average at about $5 for the next 3 or 4 years, maybe 5 years out.
Okay, wow. Kim Anderson, grain marketing specialist here at Oklahoma State University. And now here's Extension Ag Law Specialist Shannon Ferrell with information on why farmers should think of their family farm as a business.
So LLCs are a really versatile tool, and we use them for everything from transferring business interests from one generation to the next, just to providing simple liability protection. So anytime you have any sort of business where there's appreciable assets at risk, it's always a good idea to think about the LLC format for some of those reasons. You know, when you talk to most farmers and ranchers and you ask them what they want to have happen with the farm or ranch business, they'll almost always say, well, I want to keep that operation intact as it goes to the next generation. But sometimes that can be really difficult because you might have on-farm heirs and off-farm heirs. On-farm heirs might want to keep the farm asset base together, but off-farm heirs might want to have some share of the business's revenue but really don't want to have an active role in the business. And so one way an LLC can help you with that is that operating assets or land or the business itself can be placed in the LLC, and you can give different types of LLC interests to those on-farm and off-farm heirs. That way you keep the asset base together, but you're still able to give the individual heirs interests that are more tailored to what their needs would be. So an off-farm heir might be able to get income, an on-farm heir might get operational control of the assets. So it's a way of helping to deal with the interests of heirs that might have different perspectives on the farm, but at the same time keeping all those assets together and working at peak efficiency. You know, one of the first things I'd tell somebody if they're thinking about an LLC for their operation is make sure you engage your attorney and your tax professional. The tax professional is really important because one thing that you're going to have to choose if you set up an LLC is how would you like to tax it. Taxes for LLCs can actually be selected. You can choose to be taxed as a partnership, which means that all of the income and expense items actually flow through the LLC and are reported on the individual tax returns of the owners. And so that avoids having a layer of double taxation at the entity level. Everything just basically flows through the members. But for some operations, it makes a little bit more sense that they are taxed at the entity level, especially if that entity is going to provide things like salaries, retirement benefits, insurance. Those are deductible items for a separately taxed entity that wouldn't be deductible for an individual. So on an after-tax basis, in some circumstances, it might actually be better for the LLC to pay its own taxes rather than to be a pass-through. You want to talk to your attorney as well, because there are lots of considerations that you need to put into your operating agreement. Every LLC needs to have an operating agreement that basically serves as the bylaws for how that LLC is going to operate. And there are lots of things to consider there. One thing you want to define is how is your LLC going to be managed? Is every member going to function as a manager, in which case your ship has several captains, and you need to make sure that you have a means of breaking up ties or things like that. Or you might have one member that serves as a manager, and they basically act as the human face of the entity and make most of the decisions, although there's some decisions that you'll probably want to define as having to have a majority vote of all of the members. You have to make sure that your LLC is properly formed. You have to make sure that you pay all of your annual fees for the LLC, and you have to make sure that you've respected the separateness between the LLC and you. That means its bank accounts belong to it, your bank accounts belong to you. You're not using it as your personal piggy bank. There's not commingling of assets or things like that. You've respected the separateness, and if you've done that, generally the courts will too.
Ice cream is a food that almost everyone enjoys, but did you know that it's gone through several changes over the years? Historians believe that ice cream originated from flavored ices and iced wine that were popular with the Romans. However, there are suggestions that there are similar kinds of foods that were enjoyed in other areas. The expense and difficulty associated with obtaining and storing ice, especially during the spring and summer months, meant that these were special frozen treats reserved for the extremely wealthy. During the 18th century, Europeans began to develop their own version of ice cream and created recipes using mixtures of milk, cream, and egg yolk. These are the recipes that most resemble what we consider to be ice cream today. Ice cream remained an expensive treat. Presidents George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were both known to have enjoyed ice cream and to have served it to guests. However, in the 1850s, the status of ice cream as a treat only for the wealthy would change in the United States when Jacob Fussell would begin wholesale manufacture of ice cream in factories, thus bringing this delicious treat to the masses. The next time you're enjoying a scoop of your favorite flavor, take a moment to remember all of the different innovations and inventions that it took to make it possible. For more information, please visit sunup.okstate.edu or visit fapc.biz or download the FAPC app.
That'll do it for us this week. Remember, you can find us anytime at sunup.okstate.edu and also follow us on YouTube and social media. I'm Lyndall Stout. Have a great week, everyone, and remember, Oklahoma agriculture starts at sunup.